currently in the middle of my Crash Bandicoot retrospective, but I've decided to take a little detour to focus on Naughty Dog's other big franchise, Uncharted. Some things lost should never be found. Some curses cannot be undone. On the trail of a legendary treasure. These were all phrases from the E3 trailer for Uncharted Drakes Fortune, and boy did it get people hyped. There was a reason that the original codename Naughty Dog used for this game was Big. After Jak and Daxter, the team wanted to do something that was more cinematic and adventurous. Thus they created Uncharted Drakes Fortune, and the risk that this game took paid off, with critics praising the high production values and the lush environments. But let's face it, this game itself is an ancient artifact, being made all the way back in 2007. The assault president, Santa Clarita, California burned up in flames, and the second Tacoma Bridge opened. So, has it lost some of its luster since then? Well, we'll find out as we pop this baby in and jump to the story. The narrative opens with Nathan Drake and reporter Elena Fisher uncovering the tomb to Sir Francis Drake, which hid a journal that documented his search for El Dorado. After a brief argument regarding how much detail Elena was allowed to see as a reporter for her story, pirates attacked a ship, forcing Nate and Elena to fend for themselves. As pirates swarm them, Sully, Nate's best friend and mentor, flies down with his plane to rescue both of them, with Nate escaping with the diary that would eventually lead them to the treasure they sought.
El goddamn Dorado.
I must say, this is a very effective way to open the game, not only because it puts you through a thrill-ride tutorial and an all-out shooting segment with pirates, but also because it doesn't waste too much time on exposition. The game doesn't spend time at all explaining why Elena was with Nate, or what the significance with the coffin was, or why Nate was undertaking this expedition. Instead, it hits the ground running in medias res, and has the character interactions infer their intents. Right off the bat, from their conversation, I can tell that Elena clearly is with Nate more for professional reasons rather than personal. She clearly cares more for her story than Nate himself. Nate and Sully, on the other hand, have a brother-like relationship. This journey has a personal weight for Nate, considering he sees himself as Sir Francis's ancestor and not simply for the riches. It all sets up the story and characters in a more fast-paced way without being bogged down by plot holes and confusion. In fact, whenever they do need to explain something, it's usually done in a way that doesn't come across as too exposition-y. Take the following scene where Nate tries to explain to Sully about the connection between the journal and El Dorado, and all that Sully can say is,
Alright, Nate, just pretend for a minute that I don't really care about any of that stuff and cut to the chase, would you?
Man only interested in the climax. He must be a real hit with the ladies.
Never had any complaints.
almost as if this game was getting a bit self-aware of what they were doing. Anyway, deciding she was too much of a liability, Nate and Sully ditch Elena at the dock, but of course, this isn't the last we see of her. I mean, did you actually think that a chick we had an entire boat fight with would just appear in one part and then cease to be of importance for the rest of the game? No! So Nate and Sully continue on looking to where they think El Dorado is, only to learn that the Spaniards had beat them to it. As boring as some of these sections are, Nate and Sully bouncing off one another all but makes up for it. They could have made the entire game based off of their friendship.
Well, hang in there, old-timer. We're just about there.
I pawned a phony 16th century Santa off on Pablo Escobar. By the time I figured it out, I was... You've been listening to me.
Hanging on every word.
It's witty, it's funny, and through this interaction it allows us to understand Sully better as a character. Honestly, I think he has one of the more interesting reasons to go after the treasure. Whereas Elena wants to have her story, and Nate wants to fulfill his legacy, Sully wants El Dorado so that he could rebuild his life after spending too much time as a hooker. Maybe it's a bit cliche considering he's like one of those smuggler characters searching for a new life, but at the same time, it also makes him come across as grounded. Sadly, his role is cut short in the middle of the game.
Nothing to do with... Sully!
Or is it? And look who it is. It's Elena. Didn't he just ditch her at the docks? So how did she... well, never mind. With Roman's men on their tail, Nate and Elena have no choice but to take it into their own hands to find a statue of El Dorado. Overall, up to this point, the story has been moving at a solid pace. The character interaction allows us to know Nate and Sully and Elena without any backstory. The hunt for El Dorado becomes more and more intriguing and has vibes of Indiana Jones and National Treasure. Well, if you were enjoying yourself up to this point, here comes the pace killer.
So not cool!
After their plane gets trashed, Elena and Nate become separated and Nate has to go on a long quest to find her. Here the story sort of loses focus and the pacing comes to a halt. It's basically just Nate looking for Elena while fighting through enemies and jumping across ledges. It may not have been so bad if it didn't last for 1 hour and 30 minutes. Even though the game does try to remind you you're still on a quest for El Dorado, with Nate finding Sir Francis's tower and map, for the most part it felt like in these sections the story came to a crawl. So eventually Nate finds Elena and saves her from being blown off the cliff she was standing over, causing both of them to be captured by Eddie Raja, who is also competing for the treasure of El Dorado. Basically, he's just another one of your typical Asian stereotypes. Luckily, he's only in, 4 scenes? So in an amazing switcheroo of roles, it's Elena that rescues Nate in a girl boss moment. Go through a shooting section in a jeep and they escape Eddie Raja. From there, Nate is literally like, okay, I'm calling it quits, we're outnumbered and I can't continue, but Elena encourages him to keep going. And this is probably the most character-centric moment for Nathan Drake himself. Underneath all that brash and overconfidence is someone who is vulnerable. Methinks that Sully not being there with him takes a toll on him, so Elena is there instead to fill the void. It really shows how the two of them grow out of the professional relationship they once had into one that is more genuine. And there are certainly a lot of great character moments between the two, like when Elena has to let go of the camera, or how Nate shows off to her Sir Francis's ring. So it's not like the previous part when it was shooting, and more shooting, and when will it ever end? No, Nate and Elena have a lot of good character moments, and kudos to Amy Hennig for bouncing their opposing personalities off to create chemistry. But then, the most shocking twist occurs. Sully is alive, and not only that, he's with Roman and Navarro. Imagine that, the betrayal Nate feels with his father figure turning on him. Long story short, this goes absolutely nowhere. Like, no joke. I mean, it would have been an interesting plot point to build up on, Sullivan's betrayal and how Nate tries to adapt to a man that he thought he could trust without turning on him, but that would be too mature, and Naughty Dog didn't want ESRB to give this game an M rating. So you go through more shooting and platforming and catch up to Sullivan, who's revealed to have thrown Roman and Navarro off the right track. They solve a puzzle to open a secret passageway. Nothing really happens too much in this section, other than Nate learning that Eddie works for Roman. Also, Sully is backseated again because he almost got his head crushed underneath a trap. After some venturing through some national treasure like mazes and fighting through Eddie's men, Nate stumbles upon the dead body of Sir Francis Drake, realizing that he had failed to reach El Dorado. I've got to say that this really humanizes Nate. Most of the time, Nathan Drake had come across as the daring hero willing to put his life on the line in the face of any threat. But here, he basically has to face the fact the man he based his life off of wasn't all that. It helps us see a different dimension to Nate, and like I said earlier, a certain vulnerability. The duo decide to continue, albeit their spirits crushed. Here's where the story really picks up because of... Now I know where The Last of Us got its inspiration. So they fight through some zombies, and Nate goes on ahead alone. There he finds a projector, which tells him that Sir Francis didn't fail. Instead, he never wanted El Dorado to be found. The reason for this was because it was cursed, I guess? I've got nothing against supernatural explanations and stories, but the game later backtracks on this and makes it into a virus. So which is it? Details, Naughty Dog. Details. Anyway, Nate returns to find Navarro and Roman capturing Elena. Nate and Sully head to the church. Now this is the part the game takes a risk too much. So Navarro turns on Roman and steals the statue for himself. Why? Well, I guess this was the case all along, even though it was never even hinted on. In a turn of events, the helicopter all three characters were riding on ends up crash landing at a hangar site, where you have one final boss fight with Navarro. You win, you rescue Elena, and to top it all off, Sully finds gold from some pirates, so you don't leave empty-handed. So, the story. It certainly does a solid job at presenting a cinematic scope. This was probably one of the first games to do something like this, and also keep in mind that this game came out in 2007, so expectations can't be too high. However, this game runs into some issues worth complaining about, such as the fact that certain twists just come out of nowhere, or some elements are used in the latter half and never brought up again. There seems to be a lot of plot points stuffed towards the end, like the zombies or the true nature of El Dorado, that feel a bit rushed and don't have the time to be fleshed out. For the most part, I found most of the characters like Nate and Elena and Sully to be likable, but there could have been more development for them. They could have explored Nate's relationship to Sir Francis instead of simply bringing it up here and there, and while he did have a couple meaningful moments here at times, most of the game has him being brash and reckless. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it needs depth. There could have been more scenes like how Nate realized Sir Francis supposedly failed. They could have showed how that changes him into a more serious person for the rest of the game. Granted, this wasn't supposed to be a game that was terribly character-centric, but still. Thankfully, though, the performances for each of the characters are outstanding. Yeah, Elena is simplified to the caricature of being that really smart reporter girl that knows a lot, but Emily Rose brings about a new kind of life to her that wouldn't otherwise be there. Same for Nathan Drake. Nolan North brings about a hammy performance, so even though Nate might arguably be that cliched smuggler character looking for treasure, North's acting makes that cliche sort of kind of enjoyable. I guess this leads us into the sound. The musical score, done by Greg Edmondson, generally sets the cinematic mood. While the opening especially emerges with guns blazing, some of the in-game tracks aren't too memorable. I think it's because they went for a more atmospheric approach to this, but it's nothing I find worth commemorating. Although some of the intense tracks like Unwelcome Guests do give me good vibes. And I've already talked about the mocap acting. It really is top-notch. But having good quality audio is meaningless if what I'm looking at for an extended period of time is ugly, leading to the graphics. To be honest, Uncharted definitely has some scenic looks to go with it. The lush jungles, waterfalls, temple ruins. It's like they took a tidbit from Jak and Daxter and slapped it onto Uncharted, while also modifying it to make it look more realistic. While there are some uncanny looks with the character models, most of them are at least passable to decent. Although, I'd say the environments save it. Sadly, Naughty Dog didn't give it an open world to supplement it, but I'll talk more about that with the gameplay. So here we really do see Uncharted fall apart a bit. Uncharted is a third-person shooter that takes some inspiration from Tomb Raider and Gears of War. Basically, the game puts you inside of a level, and you'll be alternating between platforming sections and shooting sections. Unfortunately, they are not the most refined. Most of the levels just put you through swarms of enemies. The main issue here is that sometimes the AI will try to take you out from behind, or they might sneak up on you. So while you're hiding behind cover, you might get blown out. Hell, you might not notice that there are still enemies on the field when you think a shootout is over. What's even worse is the sheer amount of these. You see, these games' levels are long, so basically you'll be doing the same shooting and platforming sections throughout the game, especially considering that the game takes a more linear approach to its level layout. I mean, there are these treasures to find, but for the most part, they don't really give too much leeway for exploration. Not to mention that even with the linearity, sometimes the objective isn't obvious, and you'll be running around, waiting for the hint button to appear to direct you where to go. Well, I guess there are some deviations with the gameplay, which manifest in the jet ski and the jeep. And what is there really to say? They're rail shooters. except a jet ski has you crawling at a snail's pace upstream while you occasionally take aim to shoot and fire at enemies. And then you have the puzzles of the game, which need to be solved using Drake's journal. For the most part, they're straightforward. Nothing wrong with a little detour from the shooting, but I wish they were a little more complex. Most of them involve pushing the button in order or turning heads in the right direction. I guess another thing is there could have been more of these, which maybe is a bit of a first game issue. And it all accumulates with the final boss fight, which is honestly hardly one at all. Basically, throughout most of the fight, you'll be facing off against Navarro's goons instead of fighting the boss himself. The main problem has a lot to do with the fact that there are so many guys that come out, all your cover can be blown away, leaving you open to a one-shot by Navarro. Making out of that doesn't make the fight any better, because you just get near him and do 2 quick-time events. I mean, I guess at least it does give some satisfaction for beating the game, but this is how you finish it. And I guess this brings us to the verdict. Back in 2007, Uncharted truly was hailed as a one-of-a-kind in its respective genre. It was Uncharted that really jump-started gaming becoming more cinematic, and I think a lot of critics really took note of that. However, playing through it now, I can't help but feel that it doesn't really hold up to what it used to be. Many of the levels last too long, which makes the shooting and platforming segments become repetitive, and the additions like the jet ski hurt it more than help it. The story carries a lot of great cinematic elements, but ultimately falls short with shallow characters and certain plot elements being rushed. But I think this has a lot to do with this being the first game. Still, Uncharted Drakes Fortune is an outdated relic of the past. One with elements that were revolutionary at the time, but not so much now. However, am I really ready to assert that it's not worth playing? Because I did have a decent amount of fun in some parts. I'll say that maybe if you can't look past clunky shooting gameplay and are just looking for a story that is filled to the brim with adventure akin to that of Star Wars: A New Hope, then this one is for you. I can see how it has its own audience, and Uncharted Drakes Fortune, I believe, isn't a bad game, just one that time didn't treat too well. Ah well, who am I to listen to?